Okay, so if we look at chart datum very quickly, that's your dry section. Okay, rocky shore, that'll be a rock that's dry, but we've got the lowest astronomical tide, which is the one which shows us our water. So this rock will be exposed at the lowest astronomical tide. The lowest astronomical tide is as low as the sea will get with that tide recorded in that area. Okay. Up here is the highest astronomical tide. That's as high as it'll ever get. Where they don't have tides, they just use mean sea level, the average sea level. So if we look at that in bigger definition, highest astronomical tide, that's the highest spring tide you'll ever get. It's absolutely recorded the highest you ever get. Then you got your mean high water springs. That's your average high water tide. So you take all the high water tides across the year, that's your average one. That's your highest one, that's your average one. You get the same thing down here, mean low water springs. So that's obviously high water neaps, mean low water neaps, mean low water springs right down the bottom. That's your average spring lows. And then you got chart datum, this red line. That's your lowest tide you'll ever get. That is what our charts are based on. So if you see a depth on a chart, it's what's below chart datum. So for instance, tide where this boat is now, that drying height is actually underwater. Okay, so depth is your charted depth below chart datum plus your height of tide. Okay, that'll give you your depth. Your height of tide less your drying height. Because remember, your drying height is above chart datum. So it's one or the other. So just for interest sake, for instance, when we're trying to work out the underside of a bridge, all charts have the clearance under a bridge from highest astronomical tide. Because obviously that's as high as it's ever going to be for you to get under that bridge. Inversely, this is the lowest tide closest to the bottom. It's the lowest it's ever going to be. Okay, so there's your charted depth literally in height of tide. So there's charted depth plus height of tide giving you depth below that boat. The depth here is literally just that. So it's your height of tide less your drying height. So we know at chart datum there is this much drying height, and we know at the moment we got this much tide, so we subtract one from the other and it gives us that little spot there. Okay, so why do we need to know our depth? Well, I think there are lots of reasons. But if we look at it quickly and I do a little exercise, and there's a good example of why we need to know our depth. Your depth gauge reads 3.2 meters at low tide. So it's now low tide, and you've got 3.2 meters below you. If you want 4 times the depth of chain, so whatever your depth is, you need 4 times chain. How much do you need to put out if you plan to be there at high tide? And your tide table says that your low tide is currently 1.2 meters and it's going to go up to 4 meters. So the first question is, what is our charted depth? We know it's low tide, so we know we've got a tide of 1.2 meters. So what's our charted depth? It's going to be the 3.2 on your gauge less your tide giving you your charted depth, your chart datum. Our maximum tide is going to be 4 meters. We know that from the tide table. We add that to our chart datum, we're going to get a maximum depth at high water at 6 meters. So therefore we need 24 meters of chain. So if we look at that, expand it a bit, There's our 2 meters chart datum. There's our maximum height, was 4 meters. That gives us our 6 meters total. But when we started, it was 3.2 meters, 1.2 meter of height, 2 meters of chart datum. So that's one of the reasons we need to know our tides quite well. So we don't hit the bottom all the time, or we can get over things. Can I get in and out of a port if there is enough water, if it's not a 24-hour access port? The next reason we need to know our tides is tidal stream. Okay, this is a Alamy photograph, but I love it. So give them credit where credit's due, but fast flowing tides and quicksands. I think it says it all with the amount of water flow. Okay, so tidal streams is the speed and angle at which the tide comes in and out. So tidal heights, what we've just been doing now, is how much it goes up and down in meters of depth. This is how quickly and at what angle it comes in at. So two completely different things, caused by the same event, the sun and the moon and their gravitational pull and the spin of the earth, but the one is all about how deep is the water. This is about how much it's moving and at what angle. For those who know the Severn bore of the incoming tide, I mean, it happens in the UK every couple of months or every year, I'm not sure how often it happens. The tide is so strong up the Severn River, it creates this permanent wave and the guys surf it. And they get very upset when they fall out because they can't get back there. It goes too fast. So we've now got moving water. So we know they've got tide moving. We've got the water moving either one way or the other as it comes in and goes out. What's the effect of wind on that? If you've got water, tide moving in and wind going the other way, it creates incredibly aggressive seas. Really, really aggressive seas. Far more so than you'd think. Even in light breezes, you still get very aggressive seas. When you've got tide with wind, the two moving together, even in quite aggressive winds, the seas are very calm. So you really want to be avoiding wind against tide and targeting wind with tide. Then there's other effects like overfalls. Okay, so if you look at this picture, in front here it's reasonably calm. Then you've got this section of, as you can see, very, very lumpy seas. You can see this yacht beating his way through quite big swells. And then just beyond it, not far beyond it, it goes nice and calm again. That's the effect of tide coming around headlands or going over shallows underwater. Creates, again, quite aggressive seas. This one is off the Isle of Wight, the Needles off the Isle of Wight. But that's quite an aggressive overfalls there. And it can get very wet. So where do we get our tidal information from? The tidal streams and the tidal heights. Your source information is tide tables. They give you highs and lows each time. They often give you lunar phases, because obviously it affects the tide quite heavily. And then they'll give you sunsets and sunrise and moonsets and moonrises, for other useful information that appears on these things. They are very much dated, March 2020, and then days of the month. Most of them are published by hydrographic officers, but they are recorded in certain ports only. So that's a tidal height measure. Somebody comes and records it every day, high water, low water, high water, low water, and they get a table of how much the tide's going in and out, and then they know exactly what's going on. So that's a standard port, and somebody records it all. What about all the ports that don't record it? They're called secondary ports. You don't usually get tide tables for a secondary port, so you need to then work off a standard port. So standard ports. Here's Portsmouth, January last year. Nice, printed. There's the day of the month. There's the morning, afternoon, high water, low water. There we go. And it gives you a time and a height, a time and a height. And then the same for the low waters. Time, height, and some of them will do it sort of high, low. Some of them will do it as this one is, all the high waters, then all the low waters. It just depends on how they publish it. Phases of the moon, still there, just displayed in a different way. So it's the same information. That gives us our information. If we wanted to leave and get over sort of a shallow area of Portsmouth on the 10th, we would say, oh, well, my first high water is at 22 minutes past midnight. Well, I'm not going to ignore that one. And the next high water is around 1 o'clock. Great, that's perfect time. And you've got 4.5 meters of tide. Lovely, that's lots of water, even for a drying height. Remember to add your chart datum. So if we look at Portsmouth, that 4.5 meters, this whole green section here, it's very flat muds. With 4.5 meters of water on it, you can comfortably sail over that. Yet, if we go back to the next low tide, 1.5 meters, this whole area won't be dry. There'll still be a little bit of drying height, plus that 1.5 meter of tide. The only time this area will be completely dry is at the lowest astronomical tide. Otherwise, we might well see water sort of flooding the edges, making these channels look bigger, things like that, because there is 1.5 meter of tide on top of this chart datum. So if you get out there and you go, God, this place doesn't look anything like what the chart does, it could well be because you're nowhere near lowest astronomical tide, which means there's still tide filling in the green spots. You know, so that's one of the reasons everything gets buoyed and marked off very carefully. So that's Port Solent, the top of Portsmouth Harbour, and it's got a very nicely buoyed channel all the way down, gets you into the white, which is the nice deep water. The white areas, I'm just saying here, you can always keep deep water there. On most charts, it probably is white, but don't guarantee it. Remember, charts do use different colors. So how do we know how the tide comes in and goes out? This is the speed and shape that the tide will come in Portsmouth Harbour. So it actually takes, between low water and high water, it actually takes 7 hours to come in and 5 hours to go out. And as it comes in from low water, it'll have a little bit of a shoot up, and then it slows down a bit, then it shoots up again, and then it slows down, it stays gently at high and starts ebbing very slowly, and then it shoots down very, very quickly. So the first thing this curve tells us is you're going to have more incoming tide per day than outgoing, because it's 7 hours and 7 hours, not 6 and 6. Still the same 12-hour gap, but more income. The second thing this will tell me immediately is that if the same amount of water coming in 7 hours has to go out in 5 hours, it's going to be flowing a lot quicker, isn't it? Because the same amount of water that went in has to come out. The next thing this thing tells me, the red line, top right here, is your springs. That's your mean springs. It's your average springs. That's what the red line shows me. The dotted blue one, shows me what the tide does in neaps. So in neaps, it's far calmer. It doesn't have this whole jump, and doesn't have that little jump there either. So it's much more smooth curve in neaps. So this is why they record all these tides coming in and out, in and out. So how do we use this tidal curve? There's all these numbers on the left and all these bits and pieces going on. Okay. So question for us, just saying, how deep will the tide be at 1540? Here's our tide table. We collect our tide table information and we subtract our high water from our low water. That gives us our range, 3.9. We have a look at our little box here in the top right, and we say, well, that's springs. 3.9 meter range is springs, so we'll definitely be using the red curve. Okay, so there we got that information. If it's between them, by the way, guys, there is a little chart which we won't go through this evening because we could be doing this. When we do this in the classroom, it's a 3-day exercise to get all the bits and pieces done. But if it's between them, we have a computation of rates table which we use. So there is a way of doing it. Okay, so what do? We took our low water to height at 1.1, And we took our high water at 5. We just drew a line between them. Okay, high water at the top there, low water at the bottom for that day, and that's given information for us. That comes straight out of the tide tables. 5 meters at the top, 1.1 at the bottom, and we just draw a line between them. And you see it actually says high water heights in meters, low water heights in meters. Then we just take our high water time, smack in the middle there. It was 12:03, wasn't it? Given to us in the tide tables. We go in an hour either side. So we know that the low water will be around 5 o'clock. The next low will be around 5 o'clock. Equal tides. Might be out a couple of minutes either way, but that's not really relevant to us because we're also taking into account tides are predictions in heights, not exact figures. Okay, so then we go along from high water. We wanted 13:45, and we go along and we go along and we go along until we get to 13:45. Because high water was at 12:03, 15:20, that's an hour later, and that's another 45 minutes later. And we just draw a line straight up to the tidal curve. Okay, we then join the top. We just draw across parallel. Like that, where our tidal curve meets our time. So the vertical blue one here is our time. The horizontal red one is where it meets it. Okay? So it's literally on the red line there because of the springs. Where our original depth line meets our height of tide at that time is our height of water at that time. So if we look at our height of tide at 12:03, goes all the way up till it hits the curve, comes across from the curve until it hits the high water. Conversely, the same thing at low water, come up to the curve, bang, come across, there's your low water. Okay. So that's how we get a daily time tide. So that gives us 4.6 meters. Okay. Remember to add your chart datum or take away your drying height. Okay. But we can also work it the other way. We can say, okay, we want to work out when we can go sailing for that day, and we need a minimum of 2 meters of tide to sail safely. So we've got exactly the same thing. There's our low water, there's our high water. We know what the tide is for the day. Okay, we take our line from our 2 meter depth and it meets there. So we come across to our curve. From the curve, we come down there and come down here, which means between that line and that line, we're literally going to have more than 2 meters of tide. So that the two work in reference to each other. This is our depths, this side. This is our time, this side, and the curve between them. So wherever the time comes up to the curve and goes across to the depth, that's depth. Wherever we want depth coming across to the curve, that's time. So they work, but they're all reliant on this curve. And curves can vary in shape enormously. They can be enormously different. Okay, so we can go from about 640 to about 1610. And we will know we have got 2 meters of tide, not depth, tide. Okay, when you're working off time, give yourself a little bit of leeway for the time. So don't leave at 1640 on the dot and hope it's going to be all the time. Remember we did the depth calculation for anchoring and we added half a meter to the tide just to be safe? You'd give yourself half an hour either side just to be safe. Secondary ports, we've got to use one of these tables to convert it to a standard port. So this is for Butler's Hard and Stansell Point, and we use that same tidal curve from Portsmouth, and we'd have to reference it back.